The Journal of Charles Cooperton, February 9th, 1860. I begin this journal as a testament to the trials and tribulations my family has endured. May God have mercy on our souls. I feel that we are truly cursed. To think it was only 6 years since we left our ancestral home in Prince Edward Island to come to this so-called promised land of California. It feels like an eternity. I have become a widower. My left leg has been amputated and replaced with an uncomfortable length of wood so that I must limp and lean upon a crutch. I have watched as our family fortune has dripped away to nearly nothing, and now I have had to send for a priest, for the condition with the girls has grown worse. Much worse. My little twin daughters, Bethany and Josephine. They have committed acts of desecration and fornication, the likes of which I can hardly stand to think, much less commit to paper. It does in fact seem that my dear twins, only 14 years old, have succumbed to some sort of demonic infestation and are in fact possessed by devils. Even now I sit hunched over paper with my quill, turning this pale parchment black with my words. I can hear them screaming from their back bedroom, where we have had to bind them to their beds, the howls and cries, animal-like screeching, filling the void of the house. And the situation with the natives has grown steadily worse. Though we have taken pity on their outcasts and brought their sick and elderly, a widow and her children, and treat them with nothing but dignity and respect, as was the custom back in Prince Edward Island, they view us as evil and hate our pastures and fields, our barns and our fences, and most of all our mill. The attacks have grown so grievous that we have constructed a fence of sharpened logs, 8 feet in height, around the perimeter of the mill, and whenever possible keep armed guards at its gate. Now, to make all these matters at hand worse, a cold front has blown in from the north and snow begins to fall thick and heavy, covering the fields and forest in a blanket of ice. When we left Prince Edward Island for the promised land of California, our greatest fear was the journey by boat around the Horn. For 230 days we experienced nothing but auspicious sailing, and when at last we made dock in San Francisco, it appeared that the Lord smiled down upon us with blessings, for the trip was mild and without any of the disasters that have plagued so many others who have made the same journey. All 40 of us were hearty and in good health, and my wife Margaret had grown large with child. Being the eldest, it was my responsibility to go forth and find us land to farm and a heavy mountain stream where we could build our mill. I brought with me my brother Adolphus, born only 1 year after me. It was we to whom our father had imparted his wisdom and instructions in the business of men and the teachings of our Lord and Saviour, Jesus Christ. The younger 3, George, David, and John, were too young to even remember our dear patriarch, much less be taught his firm beliefs in the ideals of tolerance, participatory democracy, and diligent self-improvement. Because gold had been found in the hills some 4 years earlier, a great migration had spread its way before us in all directions from San Francisco, and we were forced to travel far up the coast to find land for lease and sale. We entertained the idea of Oregon, but in the southern region of the country of Humboldt, on the outskirts of a small town by the name of Hydesville, we discovered what appeared to be a paradise. The soil was rich, black and fertile, the game abundant with elk and deer, geese and ducks, the stream filled with the finest salmon. There was open prairie ripe for tilling, and steep hills with running water perfect for hydraulics necessary for a mill. After consulting with the local farmers and ranchers, it was determined that this would be the most excellent location to establish our mill and dairy. We secured promises for their wheat and corn to be ground in our mill, and we gave them oaths that we would proceed to build stout roads over the neighboring Trinity Alps and into Sacramento, where we could run cattle. We then made quick passage back to our family and friends in San Francisco. I, being very eager to return, wishing to make it in time for the birth of my next child, hoping my wife had not already given birth. Leaving that pastoral setting, our aspirations buoyed and dreams appeared a reality. Little could we have guessed the horror that awaited our arrival. A cholera epidemic had swept through San Francisco. 18 from our party of 40 had succumbed to the dreaded disease and perished. My wife was dead. My sweet, lovely Margaret, forever gone to me, as were the wives of all my brothers. Nearly all of our womenfolk dead. That fairer sex, it appears, did not have the strength to wherewithal to fight the disease like the men. "And what of my child?" I asked my younger brother David, who was left in charge in the absence of Adolphus and myself. "The doctor cut from her after she perished. A boy. He lived for a few moments, but died before the day was out. I'm so sorry, brother." "A male. An heir." All I could think of was that life struggling within the corpse of my beloved wife, a spark of hope that was extinguished in a day. I was bereft and crestfallen. I struggled hard with these facts, but such is life, and who are we to question the ways of the Lord? I knew I must proceed with forbearance. I had Bethany and Josephine to think of, my sweet honey-haired twin girls. Now I would be their only parent. For them I must put aside my lachrymose nature. Also, as eldest, I must make a strong and stoic face as an example to show respect for all the others in our party who had lost loved ones as well. I shed my doleful composure and made haste to gather our compatriots together for travel. Quickly we made our way north, eager to put the city that had claimed so many of our party behind us. I was now a widower with 2 twin girls to account for, leaving behind me a wife and newborn son in the cold, fog-shrouded earth of San Francisco. We are an industrious and hard-working clan, and within several years we had built barns and established a ranch with 60 dairy cows, 200 head of cattle, and 300 hogs. We harvested 1,100 bushels of wheat for our first year alone. Our dairy was the first in the region, and we sold butter to the Trinity mines for $1 a pound and packed pork to Eureka for 50 cents a pound. And on the outskirts of the settlement, on the edge of a dense redwood forest, we built our mill. The freight for the machinery, as well as the cost of labor, was immense, and took a large portion of our funds, leaving us in the end with little of the family fortune which my father had worked so hard and struggled for. But our enterprise appeared to be thriving, and we had great hope that we would soon have our initial investment back and be seeing a tidy profit. In fact, our courage and enterprise brought other settlers to the area for whom we milled redwood for their barns and houses, as well as grinding their harvest into flour and meal. We saw little of the natives in those first years, and what interactions we did have were of peaceful nature. We even befriended a few of the elderly and infirm, as well as a widow with several children, and let them abide with us, giving them shelter and food for what labor they could provide. Little did we know that a flood of European settlers was crowding the various tribes from the coast out into timber country, where they were hard-pressed to survive. Conflict, it seems, was inevitable, though we, in our ignorance, were blissfully unaware of it. The troubles began when Adolphus and I ventured out over the Trinity Alps to Sacramento, where we could secure a herd of cattle. The trip was uneventful, however. On the return, we were attacked by a fierce band of aborigines. We were forced to abandon the cattle at the Hay Fork of the Trinity River. I was shot with an arrow in the thigh. It went deep into the muscle, and its tip embedded itself in my femur. When we at last found ourselves back at our settlement, the wound was discovered to have grown septic. My entire left leg was amputated. An awful procedure, held down by my brothers as the doctor diligently performed his duty. A leather belt clamped between my teeth, the feel of that saw ripping into my flesh before it hit bone, the sound and vibration of it as it worked its way through my femur. Never before had I wished for death with such wholesome fervor. Afterwards, as I lay there in torment and suffering, leeches affixed to the wound to draw out the bad blood, Adolphus went with the team of men to reclaim the cattle. None of them returned. I would never see my cherished brother Adolphus again, nor would scouting parties ever find a corpse which we could bury and mourn over properly and give a Christian burial to. Indians were blamed, and I doubted it not. But I knew that not all tribes were violent outlaws, and that many were quite peaceful. I wished justice for the killers of my brother, but I would not blame nor slander all of the native peoples as a whole for this crime. Then the attacks on the mill began again. Because of the pressure needed for the hydraulics to turn the water wheel, we were forced to locate the mill in the cusp of the mountains, a secluded spot far from the farms and settlements. This left the mill vulnerable. Evidently, marauding tribes viewed it as being at the headwaters of the redwoods, and the river a sacrilege to what they considered a holy site, and the fields to the north, now fenced and cultivated, were once prairie where they hunted. Twice they tried to burn down the mill. We hired armed men to guard, but this proved too costly. Our funds were down to a pittance, and losing that large herd of cattle had further weakened our savings. We then built the fortifications around the mill, the tall fence with sharp-pointed tops, turning it into a fortress. This is also when the troubles with Bethany and Josephine began. Because of my infirmary, I was deemed too crippled to be of much use in the dairy or farms, so I was left to oversee the labor of the mill and tend to the books. At some point, there was a change with the girls. They began to sleepwalk. We would find them wandering the halls at night, holding hands, mumbling incoherently about the devil and the sulphurous flames of hell. One night, going to their room to tuck them into bed, as was my custom each evening, they were behaving in an especially playful manner, leaping from bed to bed, laughing boisterously. I thought nothing of it. They were 14, nearing womanhood, their bodies growing plump and curved, their cheeks rosy, and, well, I knew, silly games were all the norm for their age. Girls, it's time for sleep now. Stop this rumpus and get into your beds. But we aren't your little girls anymore, they said in eerie unison. Come now, my sweets, whatever do you mean? Why would you say such a thing as that? Because you aren't our father any longer, Bethany giggled. We have a new daddy now, Josephine stated before she too burst into a fit of laughter, her face going flush. But when I shouted, "Here, here!" and loudly slapped my hands together, they stopped their antics and crawled obediently into their beds. "Silly girls," I said, smoothing the blankets over them. "You shouldn't say such things. It pains your poor old father." They snickered. I assumed it was just the follies of adolescence and left them, taking the lantern with me so that the room fell into darkness. They had changed so much in the last 6 years, gone from children to young ladies. And in that moment, limping down the long hallway away from their room, my wooden leg dragging across the floor, I ached so hard for my lost Margaret that I felt a snap within my chest and broke down weeping. It wasn't just sorrow and pity for my own sake, but out of a deep concern for my girls. How could I, a man, raise them to be upstanding ladies in this savage land, without a single lady of refinement or standing within 100 miles? I resolved I would send them to a boarding school. I would look into the matter and find a suitable place on the morrow. That night, long after midnight, a commotion was heard in the sheep's pen. Anyone who has butchered the sheep knows the sound of a dying lamb, an almost human wail. It awoke me and several mill workers who were sleeping in the house. Grabbing lanterns and our rifles, we ventured out into the small pen behind the house to find several of the animals slaughtered most savagely. One with its head clean decapitated. The girls had done this. We discovered them laying unrobed in viscera of the gutted animals, drenched crimson in blood, and writhing in the gall. What's the worse is that they appear to have done this brutality with their own bare hands and teeth. How, I don't know, but no knives were ever found. They were insensible and babbled nonsense as I and a few servants brought them back in our home. I bathed them that night. Bathed them as if they were but babes again. Sat them in the tub and poured hot water over them, soothing and cleansing them, washing the bloody clumps from their hair, telling them it was all right, while they quietly droned on in a trance-like state. Unclean, unclean, unclean. Fearing further odd incidents of sleepwalking, I put a bolt on the outside of their door and took to locking them at night. Then it appeared a strange sickness befell them. They lay in their beds, sweating and shaking. They began to bleed from their ears and noses, and a petulant blue slime leaked from their eyes. No longer did they appear as my lovely twin daughters brimming with womanhood, ready to bloom as a rosebud may grow plump before it unfurls. They began to take on the look of monsters, their eyes often rolling back in their heads so that only the whites shone, gleaming against the dark rings. Their lips took on a rotten appearance and grew black and ragged. A doctor was called. He could ascertain no ailment. They had no fever nor swollen glands. They began to curse most vilely and blasphemously, and spoke in strange languages of which we knew not the words. This is when the doctor first opined that this was maybe a sickness of supernatural order and recommended a priest. At first I scoffed at this, and was determined to patiently ride out the strange course, hoping daily for some improvement. There was none. They refused food and began to waste and wither, their eyes sunken and haunted in the emaciated skin from which their skulls began to preside. Their beautiful and thick honeysuckle hair went limp, and tufts began to fall out. The workers around the mill began to grow uneasy, and several quit. They could hear the cries of the girls, the abhorrent blasphemies they would scream long into the night. The remaining workers began to shun me as well, and when I went to oversee the milling of the grain and lumber and check the weights and quality, an uneasy silence would fall upon the mill, punctuated by guarded whispers and furtive glances. Then came that awful, harrowing night when I found myself with no choice but to call for a priest. I awoke to the sound of giggling and moaning. It was very late. I crept into the hall and ascertained the sounds were coming from the girl's bedroom. From behind the door I could hear strange suckling sounds and girlish laughter. I unlatched the lock and swung the door open, and in the pale light of the moon, I saw a most abhorrent sight. May God have mercy on my soul for letting these foul memories surface forth from my mind and darken this pale parchment. But my girls were naked and entwined most wrongly, their faces buried between their legs, their calves encircling their shoulders, licking at each other, and this pains me to write. They must have been menstruating, for their lips were stained that dark red that can only be brought by blood. When I entered, they turned their faces to me, eyes rolled upward and fish belly white, lips a dark crimson, dripping blood, and they spoke, in unison, sultry and heavy. Come and join us, Father." 'Twas then I knew I must call for a priest.